Thank you for joining us today. This is Cody Parsons here with a special guest, Derek Broyles. We are continuing our summer series discussing the book of Mark. All right, so starting in Mark chapter 4, picking up in verse 35, and we're going to go all the way through Mark chapter 5, verse 20. It says, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him, and a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion, and the disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Chapter 5, verse 1 says, they went across the lake to the region of Gerasenes. And when Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an evil spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran, fell on his knees in front of him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Swear to God that you won't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you evil spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside, and the demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs and allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the evil spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and the countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by a legion of demons sitting there dressed in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your family, tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. So one of the big ideas that as I read these texts together and kind of look at this very moment in the ministry of Jesus, to me, what stands out is the power. When we think about the power in these two events, Jesus here in the boat is asleep on the cushion, and yet he is not terrified by this storm one bit, yet his disciples are. And we see this storm was pretty furious, and the disciples, they were very scared in this moment. When Jesus awakes, all he says is, "Quiet, be still." And we see that the wind died down and it was completely calm. And again, what stands out to me is the power here that happens. Jesus doesn't have to do any magic, no big thing. It's just literally quiet, be still, and this happens. And when we think about the demon-possessed man that they come upon as they cross the lake, as this event of the storm ends, when you think about that man as he comes up there, everyone around in the region is terrified of him because of the way he's acting, his demon-possessed, his great strength. And yet Jesus, we see no indication that he was terrified by this man at all. And we think about what happens here is Jesus, with his authority, is able to just go up to this man and talk to this man. And we see that the demons, they actually talk to Jesus. And they say that when Jesus asks, "What's your name?" the reply is Legion, because there's many of them. And they actually have to ask for permission to go into the pigs. You think about the power of Jesus. These demons could not on their own go to these pigs. They had to ask Jesus for permission. And so what these verses speak to me a lot is that power of Jesus, the power of his very word over both the elements of life, the wind, the waves, the water, but also over the demonic forces that take place. For the disciples, they're witnessing this. And for them, it has to be one of those moments where they're almost in shock at who is Jesus. C.S. Lewis, he famously said he's either the Son of God or he's a madman. It's one of the two, because only someone who is sent from God could do these very things that Jesus has done here. And it's so beautiful to me that Jesus does these things with such power, and yet he's very humble about them. There's no big bragging, no nothing. It's a very humble thing that Jesus does here. And we see that this man is healed. He is then sent. He doesn't go with Jesus either. He is sent back home to simply tell what he has done. And what a remarkable story for him to go and to tell to these people.
I have a few thoughts here that I want to share from Mark 4:35 through 41. I've got 3 thoughts that I want to share. The first thing I want you to notice when you're reading the story, in verse 35, it says, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Now, here's what I find interesting. Jesus didn't tell them, go over to the other side. What did Jesus say? He said, let us go over to the other side. To me, that's important because Jesus was going to be with them every step of the way. And I think we can draw a truth from that in our own lives. When we're going through a storm, while we may feel that we're alone, but if we're a follower of Jesus, that's not possible, right? Because we have the Holy Spirit living within us. But I think that's so powerful to me. But Jesus says, let us go over to the other side. So that's my first thought. The second thought that I find interesting as you read through the story, so it says a furious squall, right? So it was a pretty fierce storm. But I think verse 38, we can gather something from this. So Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him. Now, these are Jesus' disciples, right? The people that were the closest to him, right? Physically, relationally, maybe spiritually. But notice what it says. It says, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Now, when I read that, I find that as encouraging in my own life. Because when life hands us struggles and life strains us, God not only cares about the weights we carry, but he cares enough about them to carry that weight for us. So my piece of advice to anyone here listening, that if you're struggling with something, God can handle your doubts. He can handle your disappointments. He can handle your darkness because he already knows anyway. But no matter how you're feeling, just be honest with God. Be real with God because he already knows anyway. And then my last thought from this story, and then I'll share my thoughts from Mark 5. The last verse of verse 41, I love this verse. It says, they were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. So here's my third thought, and it's a question for you. So if even the winds and the waves obey God, my question to you is, do you? The winds and the waves obey God, but do you obey God? So as going to chapter 5, I find it interesting that as you read chapter 1, so they come from this storm, and then they don't go into another storm, but they walk into what looks like spiritual warfare, right? To me, there's another point that we can gather just from that alone is the old saying, when it rains, it pours, unfortunately can be very true in our lives, to where we may be in a storm and think, well, once I get through this one, I'm in the clear. Not exactly. It can pile and pile and pile, and you can look in the book of Job, right? Job's life is a pretty good example of that. But fortunately, it goes back to what we just talked about in Mark 4. Let us go, right? Jesus is going to be there every step of the way. But two things that stick out to me from this story about this man is on verse number 18. So verse 18, it tells him, it says, as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon possessed. To me, there's something powerful from that, because what I love about Jesus is who we were in the past does not have to be who we are today. I'll give you an analogy of this. One of the reasons I love the game of baseball is the game of baseball is a pitch by pitch, inning by inning, out by out type game. So for example, in the first inning, if you strike out, the second inning you strike out. When you get up in the third inning, it doesn't matter what happened in the first and second inning. All that matters is what's in front of you right now. And if you take what you learn from that and go forward, to me, I think that's a pretty great illustration for how life works for us. No matter who you are, you get life 1 minute at a time, 1 second at a time, 1 day at a time. Doesn't matter who you are. And then my last thought is from Mark 5:19, where it says, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. To me, when we read this story, it's pretty crazy, right? Pretty crazy, maybe a little, There's a lot of, it would make a good movie, maybe a scary movie, but there's some cinema in there. And I think what happens is so many times in our life, if we feel like we don't have a dramatic story, or we weren't delivered from this or delivered from that our story doesn't matter. But I want you to understand, your story matters. Your story matters to God. In fact, our story matters because our Savior proved what he felt about us by dying on the cross. So the very fact that we were dead in our sin and separated from God, to now we are born again in a new creation because of the grace of God, is a miracle. But even better than that, it is a story that we can all share. So my last thought for you is a challenge. Today, I challenge you to think about your story and think about the sovereignty of God as he unfolds it before us day by day as he hands it to us. Thank you for joining us today. We hope that you are enjoying this series through Mark, and we look forward to releasing more, and hopefully you'll tune in and listen in next week. Just real quick, if you would subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to, it will help you get notifications for when we release new episodes. We hope you have a great rest of the week and look forward to you tuning in next week.